And I have found that most people, especially if they're in any kind of a giving profession, they feel that it's pretty easy to give. They don't struggle with that. That's, I see a need, I fill a need, I want to be giving, and maybe even sometimes too much or at the expense of your own self-care. But receiving, how easy is it for people to receive? And overall, like really across the board, I have discovered that most people struggle to receive the kindness of another person. And I'm not going to go into the details about my own discovery about this personally, but what I realized was we're really in a world and in a cultures where it's less acceptable to take help. You have to admit you're overwhelmed, or you have to be vulnerable when you share. When you share and acknowledge that you're maybe not holding it all together and somebody else is offering to give to you. And what I've also discovered is that when we allow someone else to give to us, we're really letting them give us their gifts. If everybody wants to give, then if you push back on that, you're not allowing someone else to genuinely really serve and do what they want to do. So I encourage people to practice with compliments, because compliments are something that can get passed pretty easily. And maybe you get a compliment today on your shirt or your hair or your dress or your blazer, whatever it is, your hat. I encourage people when they receive a compliment to gracefully accept it and say thank you.
This is the Play Your Position podcast, where we huddle up, call the plays, and inspire you to run your ball into the end zone. Are you ready to score more game-winning touchdowns in your life, business, and career? Then listen up, because it's game time, baby. Now, here's your host, Mary Lou Kaiser.
Hello, Team PYP. Mary Lou Kaiser here. Welcome to today's episode of the Play Your Position podcast. I am super excited that you have joined us today because it is game day here at PYP. And if you've been a listener for any length of time, you know what that means. I have got an amazing guest suited up, ready to take the field and bring us into her leadership journey, along with all the other great things that she does. Her name is Linda Cohen, and she's coming to us today from the beautiful city of Portland, Oregon. Linda, are you ready for kickoff?
Yes, I am.
Been excited about this for a while. So, team, here's some things about Linda Cohen. She is a dynamic speaker. She considers herself a kindness catalyst, and she shares the ROI of kindness with businesses and associations through customized interactive programs for team meetings and conference keynotes. With enthusiasm and expertise, she describes how kindness is no longer a nice to have in the workplace, but an imperative skill for leaders and employees to cultivate. She says that kindness is at the basis of every aspect of a positive company culture, from recruitment and retention to morale and burnout. There's overwhelming evidence today that kindness can conquer burnout. And I know she's going to talk about that. Kindness practices build stronger organizations. So if you are interested in having someone like Linda come and speak to your team, she is available. She will tell us about how you can connect with her a little bit later. She's also got a great book called The Kindness Economy, and she is going to tell us about that as well. So Linda, let's get right to it. First, set the stage for us. We want you to bring us into your leadership journey, how you got to where you are today. When did you first get the call to leadership? How old were you? What was going on in your life at the time? And then bring us up to speed to this amazing work you're doing today.
Well, thank you, Mary Lou. So happy to be with you again, get some time together. How did I step into my leadership journey? Well, I'll just start when I was a stay-at-home mom, because there may be listeners that you have who started their journey, post college and getting my master's degree. I decided to step out of workforce life and become the CEO of our home and become a stay-at-home mom. And believe it or not, there's a lot of leadership skills that you learn when you are doing that. And make sure to keep a calendar and make sure everything is going well in your home, and you sort of are the axle of the car, really. So that would probably be the beginning. I mean, I didn't always feel that way for sure, but it was definitely a place to start learning some skills. Ran a little home-based business during those years.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I will say, kind of became an accidental entrepreneur, even though I am a born natural entrepreneur. That is like in my DNA. And my dad would have had stories about that as a teenager, and sales and marketing, I love. And I could always sell whatever it was during high school so we could raise money for the band or the choir. But really, my official kind of leadership journey, and I will just say for your listeners, I don't think it matters what your title is. I think sometimes we are caught up in this idea that I have to have a title to be a leader. And, you could have a leader who's 11-year-old little boy. You could have a leader who is someone who is just passionate about whatever they are, their journey is or their calling, and they step into something and lead without realizing it. And I will say that feels like what happened to me.
Yeah.
I feel like this was something I became called to do, to become. First of all, I got in trouble for speaking when I was in high school.
I love that story.
Yeah, my dad would definitely tell you, Linda had verbal diarrhea, and in my high school, report cards, it would be like, she talks too much. Well, I didn't even realize there was a profession of speaking, professional speakers. But I feel like I fell into this work after my father got sick and eventually passed away, to do acts of kindness in his memory, to do mitzvah, Jewish word I used. And that set the course for me, starting a blog that inspired some people, that people found. I wasn't even thinking that it was anything more than just for me to move through the grief I found, and yet people found it. And so that was kind of an aha for me. Oh, wow, my words are actually impacting someone else. And I remember the very first time somebody else commented on that blog. So from there, I wrote a book and I did a TED Talk, and I started speaking about kindness and really honing my message, and grew from a personal experience to why does it matter in the workplace, and why does it matter in cultures, and how can we treat each other with kindness, and how will that impact your bottom line? Ultimately, if you are a business owner. So I feel like my work continues to transcend personal and professional. And I feel like I'm so grateful that this is what I get to do and have been invited to do, really.
I love that you frame it as an invitation. It came out of something that was dark, obviously losing a parent. It's something you and I spoke about when we met for the first time back in September at the Courageous Leadership Conference that was so impactful. And a lot of things that you're talking about came up during that time together. And this whole concept of kindness, when you started the acts of kindness, it wasn't a hashtag yet, right? Like, it's definitely evolved into something that more and more people are talking about, are writing about, are emphasizing is so important. I would love for you to talk about what kind of impact you see bringing a kindness initiative into a company culture has. What are some things that people might notice, the before and after, for example? What are some examples of bringing kindness into the workplace that you have witnessed really do make a difference?
Yeah, I really do. So many thoughts in my head, Mary Lou, to answer your question. I mean, the first thing I will say is yes, when I first started this work, and it was really about 2006 that I lost my dad. So the blog started in 2007. My first book came out in 2011. And I remember people saying, who is going to want to talk to you about kindness? I remember getting a pushback. And at the time, I really wasn't sure. I just knew that this was what I was being told and drawn to do. And I would say, in about 2015, 16, people stopped asking me that. And I began to see that more people were leaning into this idea of how can we elevate this conversation around kindness? What I would say is, I think kindness, and you said it in your introduction about me, I think it impacts every part of our workplace. Because if somebody comes to your company and they are an employee for you, they are still a whole person outside of the job description. So they still have things going on personally that are impacting how they show up in your culture. So if you are strictly treating them like a cog in a wheel, they'll know that. They will feel that. And if you switch that and your culture is, this is a whole person showing up here with everything going on, and I'm going to give them patience and grace, and I'm going to try to communicate with them. I'm going to ask what's going on. I'm going to try to make sure that the setting we create in this culture is diverse, and we're listening to different voices, and we're allowing people to be autonomous and step up. And I'm sort of, in a nutshell, telling you what I know happens when the cultures that look at elevating a culture of kindness do this. Your employees feel it. They are champions for your organization because they feel like they belong. They feel like they matter. They feel like their work matters. They feel like they're part of something that's bigger. And so I've seen it. I'll just give you a teeny little story. In one of my clients last year, I had a client and we decided they were in long-term care, which is an industry I speak to pretty often, that in healthcare. And so we created a kindness bingo. I actually have that as a resource on my website. We can talk about the website address if people want to look that up. But we created a kindness bingo. And one of the squares was smile at someone you struggle with.
Oh, yes.
We launched the bingo last January for this long-term care organization. And one of the general managers came back to us, after we launched it. And she said, I have a funny story to share. She said, my receptionist said that was not a square she could do. She was struggling with it because the person she struggled with in the organization, she just didn't think she could smile at them, but she tried it. Because it was a kindness bingo and we were trying to do all the squares, she tried it. She said, I smiled at her for 1 day and 2 days and 3 days. And she said, you know what? On like the third or fourth day, she smiled back to me. We had a little conversation. She said, I had a bit of an aha. Maybe it was me that was the problem. And by shifting my body language or smiling or engaging, maybe I shifted the energy that we had with each other. So, I think sometimes in this work around kindness can also be loving kindness to ourselves.
Yes.
Another resource I have on that page is, self-care for busy leaders. Because if our pot, and we talked about this just when we got on, how are we filling our joy pots right now? How are we filling our tanks? If our oxygen is depleted, if our joy tank is completely empty, we are never going to be able to serve a fellow employee, a manager, anybody. So it's important both to look at it kind of as a cultural thing and personally, making sure that I'm filling my tank. And I have several tools that I love to teach and share around how do I do that? And how can I do that even if I'm so busy I can't find 10 minutes for myself in a day? I have a couple of ideas for 1 minute, 5 minute, 10 minute, ways to fill your tank.
Yeah, why don't you share? Let's give a 1 minute example because everybody has 1 minute. I mean, for goodness sake, put the phone down. Stop scrolling Instagram.
That may be one of the tips.
Right.
I mean, really, if you only have 1 minute, how about 3 deep breaths? How about deep breaths into your belly? For my healthcare and long-term care people, it might be pausing at the door before I enter the patient's room or the resident's room and just taking that deep breath. So I enter more mindfully, because this next patient or this next resident may be challenging. It may be hard. There may be something, and I want to bring that energy from the last patient or the last engagement I had to the next one. I don't have the list out, so I'm like, what else?
That's okay.
That's 1 minute. I know one of them, a few minutes more, is shut the door if you have a door, or, I guess if you don't have a door, step outside, give yourself a breath of fresh air outside or under the trees or see. And then there's a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 meditation, which is probably if you have 10 minutes, which is just really a grounding meditation in this precise moment with what do I see, what do I hear, what do I feel. So I love that one as well. But
yeah, this idea that we don't have time to take care of ourselves is so ingrained in our culture, especially for women. But I also know from talking with men that they struggle with it too. And culturally, it hasn't been as, I guess, allowed for men to talk about self-care. Like there's a lot of, cultural messaging around being tough guy. And you just, tough it out and, stop crying, or, oh, massage and pampering is for women, stuff like that. And the fact of the matter is we all need touch, right? We need from a massage standpoint, there's just that release of the stuff that we build up from being so busy all the time. And the breathing that you talked about, the deep belly breaths have been shown to I know if you take 5, one, through your nose and you hold it and deep in your belly and then exhale, if you do 5 of those in a row, it can change the pH balance of your whole body from acidic to a more neutral or balanced. And we forget we have this tool at our disposal every day, all day long.
Exactly.
And I love one of the things I think you spoke about when I heard you speak, Linda, was the power of the pause. Taking the time to just stop, even if it's for 30 seconds before you walk through a door, or changing your scenery, which could be walking outside the door,
right.
As a means of it's like cleansing your palate. And our dear friend Maria Ponzi, who I've had on this show and talks about the 4-ounce pour, right? She would talk about anybody who's a wine lover, or even if you just like food, you want to cleanse your palate between flavors and tastes. And if you're going to have something bitter, you don't want to just then grab something spicy right after. You want to make the runway ready, right? And it's the same thing that you're talking about with the breathing and the shutting the door or walking outside. And so in the industries that you serve a lot, the long-term care and the healthcare, these are 2 huge industries. And I know there are people listening who have loved ones who may be in whether they're in the hospital or they've just put grandma or mom or dad into a memory care facility or something. What are some tips you have for around your kindness message for people who are perhaps facing some tough decisions, some tough family situations because there's illness or just someone getting older and perhaps has some memory things? What are some ways that we can address this with ourselves and with our extended families where we might have to be making some hard decisions?
Well, I have met some of the most kind people in long-term care and in healthcare. I mean, people who have really chosen these careers because they are passionate about being there for other people. I mean, their work is so in service to other people. And COVID has not been easy for them. They have been overworked, understaffed, overwhelmed, exhausted, hitting close to burnout. So I would say if you are engaging with a professional in any of these organizations, bring your best self to them, smile at them, learn their names, give them a little more. And this actually goes back to when I know you did my intro and you talked about that kindness can decrease burnout. When we engage with people at a human to human level, it changes the interaction. It's no longer transactional, and it is now coming from a place of compassion. And that is actually some of the research that was showed by a couple of doctors on the East Coast who wrote a book called Compassionomics, which I got my hands on. And the coolest thing about doing this work now for 15 or so years is that more and more research continues to show us why kindness, empathy, compassion can change how we're doing in the world. And so it showed that if you're less transactional, you will end up being feeling less burnout. So the more compassion you give, the better you might feel. So I would say do what you can if you are a customer or a client in this situation. And somebody who's working in this profession, they never forget those gratitudes that they receive. I have been in audiences of nurses and I will ask, or long-term care professionals, I'll ask, have you received recognition for your work? And, I've had a long-term care executive hold up an entire basket of thank you notes that he received over the year of work. And, and they all say on a tough day, I might dig into that basket. I might look at that place where I've kept all those thank you notes. And I love that my work goes into recognition, because I think when I remind people that recognition happens, they say, oh, right, I forgot about the things I did last week or last month or last year for my employees or my clients or my patients. And then we get to talk about how they felt when they were recognized. And it just brings up for them that idea that you are recognized. We do see you, even though, and I remember at the beginning, and I wrote my second book during COVID, 2021, I wrote my second book, The Economy of Kindness, How Kindness Transforms Your Bottom Line. And I remember, I think in the intro, I talked a little bit about how we banged the pots at 7:00 for all the healthcare workers, and I had conversations with healthcare workers talking about how food was delivered to them. In the early days of COVID, I even called it a kindness pandemic, the first couple of months of the pandemic, because we were aware of who was still working out in the world.
Yes.
And many
Yes.
of us who were not working out in the world and we were told to stay home, we had a totally different experience of what COVID was like. And so, I think just having that sensitivity as we are now 4 years later, what does that look like for somebody who's actually had a very different experience than you might have had as a frontline worker throughout the last 4 years?
Yeah.
Them just grace and patience can be really something you can give to them, and it doesn't cost you anything.
Right. It does just a little bit of time to write. I found that when I receive a note, a handwritten note from somebody, it doesn't have to have, a lengthy tome in there. Even if it's just a couple of sentences saying something like, "It was great to meet you," or "I loved blah blah." It makes your day, and it also feels good to write them and send them.
Absolutely.
So it's not just receiving, but it's also on the giving end. Now that brings up another point I wanted to make sure you talked about today, because I asked you this question at the end of your talk at the conference, and that was, in your work, have you found people have a harder time giving or receiving? And I would love for you to talk about what you shared and why that is.
Right. And I asked this question. I was so happy that you asked that question, because it's one of the things, and we only had a short amount of time to talk at that conference. So
Yes.
I didn't do all of my conversations around this. And in most audiences, I talk about giving and receiving. And I have found that most people, especially if they're in any kind of a giving profession, they feel that it's pretty easy to give. They don't struggle with that. That's, I see a need, I fill a need, I want to be giving, and maybe even sometimes too much or at the expense of your own self-care. But receiving, how easy is it for people to receive? And overall, like really across the board, I have discovered that most people struggle to receive the kindness of another person. And, I'm not going to go into the details about my own discovery about this personally, but what I realized was we're really in a world and in a cultures where it's less acceptable to take help. You have to admit you're overwhelmed, or you have to be vulnerable when you share, when you share and acknowledge that you're maybe not holding it all together and somebody else is offering to give to you. And what I've also discovered is that when we allow someone else to give to us, we're really letting them give us their gifts. If everybody wants to give, then if you push back on that, you're not allowing someone else to genuinely really serve and do what they want to do. So I encourage people to practice with compliments, because compliments are something that can get passed pretty easily. And maybe, maybe you get a compliment today on your shirt or your hair or your dress or your blazer, whatever it is, your hat. I encourage people when they receive a compliment to gracefully accept it and say thank you and smile and acknowledge it. And that is a practice of you receiving a kindness that someone else is giving you. And I say, if you don't get a lot of compliments, then start giving them. That's another thing you can practice. Just how does it feel to be aware and looking at other people and be genuine and be authentic? You don't want to be corny about this, but give a compliment to someone else. And it could be in a professional setting. It could be that, a coworker just delivered something that was really impactful or made a difference to you. And for me, I call those testimonials, but when someone gives me a compliment about my work and how it impacted them, you can do that as well in the workplace. But then you can practice receiving them as well. So I think it's important to think about that, because we can change how we receive. And I think these days, and I think during COVID, people did get better sometimes at receiving, because, it was hard. It was hard as we all weathered this, and none of us had ever gone through an experience like this. So I think sometimes we were a little more open to receiving sometimes, and some people.
Yeah.
It's halftime here at the Play Your Position podcast, and we've got ourselves a great game. While you're up grabbing another snack and topping off your favorite beverage, make sure to subscribe to the show so you never miss another play. PYP is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever great podcasts can be found. Now, let's get back to the game.
I saw both ways. So yes, COVID, we were first, it is hard to believe we're coming up on 4 years when we were first told you cannot leave your house. And again, the industries that you serve frequently, Linda, you're still seeing the hangover of COVID, I imagine, in there, in the facilities that you visit and speak to. And in what ways, I guess I'm curious, in what ways, is there such a thing as kindness overkill? Can somebody be too kind all the time? I mean, I guess you just said something about authenticity. Can kindness become a tool of manipulation?
It could. But what I will tell you is in the last couple of months, I have been so lucky to partner with some women who are also in the business of kindness. I'm not the only one. Surprisingly, I'm not the only one, but I've been doing my work solo for many, many years, and I have had some connections over the years through LinkedIn and through other professional networks. Oh, you should meet this person. They're also working sort of in this space. And I have a colleague in Chicago, and somebody hooked us up on LinkedIn, and we have had some personal face-to-face Zoom calls. But a couple of months ago, she said, let us get together a group of us who are all doing this in our own way, and let's come together. And I think this felt like we could amplify each other's voices if we did this. And we've only had a couple of Zoom meetings, but it has been fantastic to know that together we're going to be stronger. Together we can support each other's message. Right now, there aren't enough of us talking about kindness to sway the amplification of kindness away from the amplification of all the bad, I think, in the world. Yet we all know, especially those of us doing this work, we know and I did a series. I did this series since I saw you in downtown Portland on my birthday last month in October.
Talk about that.
Probably going to air in December. Yeah. But because I'm sort of in my own little kindness silo, and by the way, I think kindness gives you energy. So I don't think there could be too much kindness if it's coming from a genuine place, if it's really you being genuine and not like trying to do it. If it comes from your heart, it's going to give you lots of energy. But I went to downtown Portland and I started talking to strangers, just anybody who walked by me. And it was kind of a dreary, rainy day, but we stood under an overhang near downtown. And so people were able to come and talk to us. And overwhelmingly, I talked to about 20 people. Each one of them shared, oh yeah, and somebody just bought me coffee in the coffee shop, or someone just chatted with me, or a homeless gentleman, someone who had been houseless in the past, told us that he doesn't have a lot to give, but he loves to give. And he's also received over the years. And it was really amazing to get to talk to those people. And by the way, I had an retired NFL football player show up in my little area. And of course, I didn't know him, and played for the Miami Dolphins, though.
Cool. Yeah. I think, on a side note, I think when, famous people in their realm, whether it's sports or entertainment or, industry, I think sometimes like that they're not known. It feels less, there's that wall of, oh, I'm this, they're thinking of me in this way instead of just being a human.
Exactly.
Right. Because everybody who is in some kind of public eye for a season or for decades, depending on who the person is, they go home at night and they're just like the rest of us. I mean, yes, they may have a bigger house and a fancier car and more money in their bank account, but they're still human. They still struggle. Life is not always easy. People die. People leave. People do dumb things. And we're all wrestling with that, which is why the work you're doing, I think, is so, first of all, wonderful. And it's cool to hear you talk about there's other people in it that you're now aligning yourself with who bring a different flavor of this message of, kindness does matter. And it, like anything else, it's a practice. You just learn. I think some people, I would imagine, Linda, you've been a kind person your whole life, that you didn't have a aha moment of like, wow, I've been mean, now I'm going to be kind. I think there are some people that may be true for. But what would you, let's talk to the parents in who are listening, because I know there are some people who are raising children or may have young adults in their lives like you and I do. What are some tips about teaching and modeling kindness for a generation that seems that gets maligned a lot in the media for being very entitled. I mean, there's all kinds of negative words that we associate with these younger generations. It's like, oh, they're always on their phone and they don't know how to look you in the eye. And yet I know some great young people who are not always on their phones and do know how to look you in the eye. So what are some ways to model, being kind to themselves? Because I know a lot of young people beat themselves up. They're comparing themselves to the gram or to Facebook, right? What do you talk about with that?
It's so funny. Again, a million ideas just flowed through me. I mean, one of the conversations with some of my long-term care groups is that there are younger generations who are being hired into their organizations. And like you said, they don't know how to look people in the eye. It's just because they haven't ever maybe had that modeled for them. They have been raised, and my son is going to be 23 this week, and he's been raised with, a phone since seventh grade or whatever. So not his entire childhood, but they came out, when he went off to middle school. And so I think, and he actually, I'm very happy. Like, we didn't have phones at the dinner table any of their years through junior high and high school. We did have kind of a standard dinner hour together. But if a child or a young adult has been raised where that wasn't the standard, then you as a boss could be the one who helped talk to them about, especially if you're getting into long-term care work, probably they like seniors. And you could help them realize that, relating to a senior can give you so much wisdom, so much guidance. And that's actually one of the things. My first job in my 20s was actually in long-term care. So I have this I was 22, and I remember Rose Brown was the woman I talked to about whether I should marry my husband, because I'd been dating another guy in LA, and I had come back to the Massachusetts area, and I wasn't sure if this new guy was the right guy. And I remember 92-year-old Rose, sitting with me and sharing her wisdom about what I should think about.
What did she say? Tell us.
She said, it matters if he, what are his values and what does he want out of life? And do you see that you line up with that? And, my grandmother had already passed away. So I felt like Rose Brown was sort of a surrogate grandma to answer some of these questions. And we've been married 30 years. So I guess it was some advice that definitely stuck. And we're very different. We're very different, but we bring each other. I think we bring our differences together. And that has been wonderful. We've had to have a lot of conversations over the years because
of course
I talk too much and he's quiet.
He's quiet.
So he needs some time to talk to. And, it's like the same conversation over 30 years. But going back to your idea, so I think and the one thing I thought of when you asked that question, I remember a story, and I'll give your audience, if you don't follow Steve Hartman, his segment On the Road, I think it's on CBS. It's so wonderful. And during COVID, he did a whole thing about Kindness 101. If you are a teacher, any kind of educator, go find that series. His Kindness 101 series was fantastic. He was doing it in Massachusetts with his 3 kids who were all school-age kids at home. And his daughter was like 8, and she just stole the show. She was so adorable. But he did a segment once with a McDonald's manager who, and maybe you don't think of being a McDonald's manager as particularly glamorous, but this woman saw it as her mission to help the young people who were in her world, in her, in her franchise, to help them be the best selves they could be. And so this was a story that Steve Hartman did about one of the young men who she helped him go off to college. He was the first person probably in his family or even in his community to get a chance to go to college. And she supported him through that, emotionally. I don't know if it was financially, but the stories that he shares are always so uplifting. So I guess I would say that if you are a manager, you get to help the people you manage be the best selves that they can be. And that's part of where kindness comes in, is seeing people as a whole person. And, and I think that when people feel hopeless, and I know that there's been a lot of conversations in the last couple of years that it just feels like there's so much that's broken in our world. You can't solve everything that's broken. And this kind of came to me. This was the thing that came to me years and years ago when I first started my mitzvah project. I can't solve all the problems in the world. Obviously, no one of us can. But is there something that I can do in my community, in my world, in my corner, where it can make a difference, where it can impact people? And I think that goes back to your leadership question. There was an 11-year-old boy, and I answered your question by saying there was an 11-year-old boy who won the Time magazine kindness kid of the year, like a year or two ago. And I read the article about this little 11-year-old boy who decided what he could do in his community.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's when we inspire other people to do what they can do. Every one of these stories. And gosh, Mary Lou, my dream is that someday we have a station like, CNN or NBC or whatever that is just the good news that's happening in the world, with documentaries about Mr. Rogers and all the people I know, people who maybe their names and people who you don't, who are just making a difference in the world. And I know that the media thinks that nobody will watch that. Nobody will be interested in that. But during COVID, and I'm forgetting his name, but there was an actor who did Some Good News, and he did like 8 segments of them.
Mm-hmm.
He was from The Office, and I know his first name is John, but I'm forgetting his name.
John Krasinski.
Yeah. So he did Some Good News, and it was a hashtag, and he ended up doing like 8 episodes on YouTube, and they got like 7 or 9 million viewers. It was well loved. And so I don't know. I always hope that would inspire people to realize that we would love to hear the good stories. People, it restores their faith in humanity. And so I think that the good news stories could also be a platform that we would all enjoy listening to and looking at.
Absolutely. I mean, my mother is a David Muir, ABC nightly news junkie. And at the end of every 30-minute nightly news on ABC, there's a positive story because the rest of the news is not.
Right.
Every other story.
It's 17 bad news stories for that one good news story.
That's what it is. That's what it is.
Could we shift that?
I'm with you on this.
5 good news stories for the 12 bad news stories. Like, come on,
Yeah, let's up the ratio here. We don't not 1 to 17.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is interesting when someone who has a platform or a following like a John Krasinski or Steve Hartman, where they have the visibility and people do respond.
Absolutely.
Because as you said, we are inundated with the negativity constantly. And it sometimes feels like our kindness doesn't matter, that we can be kind, we can be generous, we can be thankful. And yet at the end of the day, we still feel defeated. And I know that's a mindset. And even really good people like yourself, I count myself in that conversation too, who are aware of kindness and aware of bringing good energy to the world. We're going to have our days when it's just not lining up. And I was thinking of I wanted to get your take on if you've had a spell of negativity or bad energy and maybe crossed a boundary or did something that was hurtful to somebody else, or you knew after, words might have just come out of your mouth because you were hot. And that happens to all of us sometimes. What's a kind way of apologizing to someone when you recognize you have broken maybe an unspoken rule or maybe overtly crossed a boundary?
Yep. I mean, definitely I have, of course. When we're hot under the collar or time is, we feel stretched, we are not as patient as we can be. I know in my mitzvah book, there are at least a couple of stories where I behaved something that I was not happy with to, somebody was working with me at a community center, and I went and apologized. And actually, I just reread, I was speaking recently to an audience, and I hadn't looked at my 1,000 Mitzvahs book in quite a while. And you think as an author, you remember everything you wrote. And I did not. And it's kind of fun to go back to. And also my kids are now in their 20s, and I wrote the book. They were like young school-age kids. So it was like, oh, I forgot that they did that. But I had an experience where I got hot under the collar with somebody in a community center, and I went back either the next day or that night, and I apologized to her. And I told my kids what I had done because they had seen me behave in a way that I wasn't proud of, and I wanted them to know that. And I think the other thing is, I'm so blessed, and I have wonderful kids, and I feel like I did model things, and they learned from what you do. But I remember my son at like age 11, he would always call me out when I was not behaving my highest, like, why were you yelling at the woman? I just remember we were returning movies at Blockbuster. Remember Blockbuster in the day? And we had movies to return, and we were late for school, and there was somebody really slow slowly pulling out in front of me. And I'm like honking my horn. And he was like, Mom, like maybe she's going to the hospital to visit a family member. Maybe she has somebody in the military, like calm down. And I just remember like, oh, yes, you're right, Solomon. But it was, kids will definitely think that about things. So.
Oh, they will. And they are going to do what we do.
Yes,
definitely. So what do you remember just the gist of what does an apology sound like?
I mean, I'm sorry.
Just straight, I'm sorry.
Straight, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I did not behave in my highest way. And I know I took it out on you, and it was really rules of the organization and you were just following those. And I apologize. I'm embarrassed at how I behaved. I hope you'll forgive me. I think that's all you have to say.
Asking. Oh, interesting. Yeah. Asking for forgiveness. Okay.
And I think a straight up apology. I think there's another story in there about a hairdresser. And I remember, and I reread that story I had forgotten about too, where I can't even remember what it was, but I had to go back and apologize to her as well. Because I did not think that I behaved in the right way. And I was glad I did, because I think it was a misunderstanding on both of our sides, and being able to have that opportunity was important. So, I mean, there are books written about forgiveness, and there are books about, asking for when you've behaved incorrectly. But I think part of it is just monitoring yourself, and knowing maybe I want to pause before I respond. If you are mindful enough to know I'm hot under the collar and this is not the right time to engage in whatever it is, maybe I take a break. I mean, and you know what else? I know if you have close people in your life, your kids, your spouse, a significant other, those are often the people you are the shortest with. I've had to apologize to my children for misstepping. And, I think it's okay. We're all human. Like you said, the movie stars, the famous people, the powerful people, they're all just people. They don't behave 100% the way they should either. Hopefully they do have a way to be able to say, I'm sorry if I've done something I'm not happy about at this point.
I think apologizing is a really big part of being kind. It's not just to the person that we trespassed against, but it's also, I think, a way of relieving our own stress over, oh my gosh, I wish I hadn't said X or Y or Z. And if we hold that and don't close the loop, it's still there. And I'm sure people and have heard stories, I certainly know, where there was a wrong committed in some way, and that ended the relationship because the pride or whatever got in the way of owning up to the mistake, owning up to admitting, hey, listen, I was really stressed out and it's not an excuse and I really am sorry. So I thank you for talking about that, and also adding in the piece of, I hope you can forgive me, because yes, forgiveness is a completely different category. I see it as a cousin to kindness, because forgiveness, it's a letting go. And I think it's one of the kindest things we can do for ourselves is if there is something from our past that we continue to grate over and run in our heads and not forgive,
right?
It'll eat us up, and it will interfere with our kindness abilities.
100%. And I just want to circle back, because when we talked about how I started in this work, my dad and I had a difficult relationship. And so being able to ask forgiveness before he was gone helped me grieve in a way that was positive and find a way and a meaningful way to lean into the next stage of my life. And I encourage people when I do talk in audiences, and I've had people come up to me afterwards thanking me for the reminder that while my person that I struggle with is still alive, if it's safe and if it's possible, and that is not always the case, so I'm going to put that as a caveat, if it's safe and if it's possible. And my dad was a therapist, so it was very possible with him, because I think there was just years of misunderstanding, and I hadn't been a parent yet. And, there was just a lot of stuff. And I was ready to forgive because I knew that time was of the essence. So I encourage my audience members to consider that. And COVID, if nothing else, it taught us that, and we know life is fleeting. We do not know what's coming next. We don't know. And so, being able to say, I'm sorry, ask forgiveness, move on, it's going to make you probably fill your joy cup a little bit, be able to live in a little bit more of a joyful place. So, and I would just want to go back to you saying that, am I always sunshines and unicorns? I've lived through everything everybody else has. And there are times when it is very challenging. And I would say it's a daily practice. It is a daily practice of, what do I need to fill my cup so that I can serve in this way that I've been called to do? I do sort of now feel like this is sort of a calling. I mean, I don't know if anybody would say, I'm going to go talk about kindness when everybody else thinks kindness is a weakness, or, who's going to hire you for that or whatever. So every day, how can I make sure I'm doing what I need to do so that I can have these conversations and serve and help inspire and be the kindness catalyst? I mean, I love that. Somebody gave that to me, but I feel like I'm a spark. I'm a spark, and I'm trying to put that out there so that, because this is not rocket science, right? I'm not telling you anything you don't already inherently know. It's maybe something that's been buried or culturally put down in your mind, and you're like, oh, it's not that important. But maybe if I raise it up a little and I bring it forward, then I'll be able to lean into that. So,
absolutely. And just throwing in the little football story, I have noticed in the last, I think probably since COVID, a real shift in the way that the coaches of teams, whether it's college or NFL, are talking about the way they coach. And there's a lot more I love yous. There's a lot more, we are a family and we will treat each other in the best possible way as a family. And, many coaches, when they're interviewed post game, the journalist will ask, well, what do you attribute this to? And so many are now saying, I love these guys. I mean, it's a definite shift in our culture. And I think COVID was definitely ushered that in. But I also think there is an awakening, and it's people like you, Linda, who are talking about why this is important and using #kindness and writing books about it and modeling what's possible. And for people who'd like to know more about you, perhaps bring you in to speak, or just know somebody that could use a boost, where do you hang out online?
I'm on LinkedIn. So find me, Linda M. Cohen, and I'm sure you'll put that in whatever notes you do.
Absolutely.
My website, lindacohenconsulting.com. If you are in healthcare, I have a whole healthcare page. It shares with you the different kinds of things I could talk about in your organization and some of the organizations and associations I've already spoken with around the world, really. And I would love to offer a couple copies of my book. So I don't know if you have a listener who pings me, send me an email, and maybe I'll give away, 3 or 5 copies. So I'd love to send that to you. The Economy of Kindness, How Kindness Transforms Your Bottom Line. It is on my website. And I will tell you that, generally I'm brought in for 45 minutes or an hour. And the second book was really the amazing stories that I have heard in audiences. I have been so lucky, and that's one of the things that really feeds me, is that I get to hear how people get recognized, the different stories that have happened to businesses and organizations and individuals. And so I tried to put all of those into the book so that it's an uplifting read, and it'll help you if you're a manager or you're an employee. What can I do? What do I have some control over that I could do? So that's what I tried to put in that book. So,
well, that is a generous offer. And I can tell you, team, I was a lucky recipient of Linda's book, and it is a wonderful book. It has universal application. You don't have to be in healthcare or long-term care to get something from this book. The stories are very genuine, and it's definitely inspirational. It makes you step back and say, oh, wow, there are things I can do, and they're not hard, in terms of when you're looking at simple versus complex. I guess complex is more of the word I'm looking for. They're not complex. It doesn't take a lot to make somebody's day and express just an ounce of kindness can go so far. And speaking of books, Linda, I'd love to have guests share the books, 2 or 3 books that have been instrumental on your leadership journey. What are some of those perhaps favorites that you have, or one that you've read recently that just changed the way you see things?
So I just picked up, well, first of all, The Art of Gathering, and I can't remember her name, but it's Priya, and you'll maybe have to look it up. But The Art of Gathering,
I'll look it up.
Came out during COVID, and it was on my nightstand for several months, and I loved it. She really brought together some great ideas. And there's a new book on the bestseller list that I just got a copy of, David Brooks. and it's just out. And I heard him interviewed and I got a copy of it. And he's talking about a lot of the same things that I have been thinking about and talking about. So again, I love that overlap. I also have, I have on my nightstand Mindful and Lion's Roar, 2 magazines that I subscribe to that I find very helpful for just putting my own mindset in the right place where I want to do so. Those are a couple magazines I really recommend.
Great. I will definitely put links to all of these on your show notes page.
Great.
Over at pyppodcast.com. And as we wrap things up, Linda, my final question to you is what do you hope that your leadership legacy will be?
I feel like I'm already living that, to be honest. I feel like it is getting the note back from someone who says, your conversation with me helped me turn a corner. I am now leaning into kindness in my own life. I feel like I help light an idea for them. And that feels very gratifying. I mean, I'd love to do it on a bigger scale. I'd love to be able to do it even more than I am as a single person doing it in the organizations I am. And maybe that'll be what's coming in this next chapter. So we will see.
Yeah, I feel it coming. And this has been so great today, Linda. Thank you so much for bringing us into your kindness world and reminding us that it's not hard to be kind. And it's not only good for others, but it's really good for ourselves. So thank you so much for being here today.
It was such a pleasure. I'm happy to be with you.
Hey team, Mary Lou here. Who's number one in football changes from year to year. Fashion trends come and go, same with musical tastes. But leadership skills, they never go out of style. In fact, these days, leadership is an essential survival skill for a world that demands more from us than ever before. To succeed these days, you need to know how to show up for yourself so that you can then do the work you love with people you like the way you want. The Play Your Position Leadership Playbook helps you do this, and it's free. Go to pyppodcast.com to download your copy today. If being more successful this year, next year, in the 21st century is on your to-do list, get your copy of the Play Your Position Leadership Playbook now. pyppodcast.com. It's at the top of the page. You can't miss it. That's pyppodcast.com, and start being more of the leader you are meant to be today. This podcast was produced by Daniel Romeros. Show notes for this episode can be found over at pyppodcast.com. I'm Mary Lou Kaiser. Thanks for listening.
Here at the Play Your Position podcast, we believe that the road to self-mastery and a life well lived starts with answering the call to leadership. That's when the fun really begins. Send this episode to any friends who might need to hear the inspiration and ideas you heard today. And feel free to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform.